People will try and say that, oh, we put you in a different shaft and using the different shaft characteristics, that's going to change things. The difference that that makes is very small in general, and it's very inconsistent both from player to player and short term to long term.
Today we're joined by Adam Charen. Adam is a club maker and club fitter who has the YouTube channel Mobile Club Maker Golf and Elite Fit Golf. Adam takes his YouTube channels and dives into questions that amateurs have, teach them useful tricks, including how to measure your lie angle without having a lie board, and why a lie board might not be so useful, as well as other things like how to regrip clubs only using compressed air. Adam is a wealth of knowledge, and we really enjoyed this conversation with him. For people who don't know about you, um, let's start just with your background. One, how you got into golf, just in general, playing golf, etc. But two, for the people that don't know, you have a YouTube page, Mobile Club Maker Golf. You also have Elite Fit Golf, which is something you've opened. We want to hear more about that. So tell us, one, just how you got into golf, and then two, how you got into club fitting, club making, everything in that area.
Okay, well, first off, yeah, thanks for having me today. I've been playing golf for my whole life, basically, since I was, 6 years old, something like that. My dad would take me out to the golf course with him, so it's been part of my life for a very long time. After college, I I got a job working for Golfsmith, which probably a fair number of people still remember, even though they've gone out of business now a few years back. But they were a company who was big into not just golf retail, but also club building. And, they had a big following with club builders, and they made their own components and all this sort of thing. So started working with them, learned club building sort of through that. And so that's sort of where my club building knowledge came from. And then got out of that, got into some other things, and then just eventually started doing that again, doing more club building, reaching out to the Emory University golf coach and said, look, I'm a club builder, and so if the team needs anything, I'd be happy to help you guys out. So doing that, and then just sort of going from there. And then I started the YouTube channel basically sort of because I realized that there weren't a lot of people who knew how to do this stuff as far as building, repairing, even the simple stuff, obviously, regripping. There's nothing overly complicated about that. Although, still, I think most people are still sort of in the dark about something as simple as that. But anything beyond that was basically there was a small number of people who really knew how to do it, and the number kept getting smaller because most of them were older. So that was kind of where the YouTube channel started, showing people how to build, how to repair golf clubs, and uh, and yeah, and sort of went from there.
That is cool. When it came to like starting the YouTube channel, did you think, hey, this is gonna get pretty big, and now it's large enough and you have enough of large enough following that you're able to have a business on top of that. You're able to open up Elite Fit Golf. Was it something that you saw happening, or how did that progression happen for you? And when did you realize, hey, people are paying attention to what I'm saying? Like I'm putting interesting stuff out there. When did you die? When did you really get into that?
Yeah, YouTube is an interesting beast. It is, it's so massive. You don't even appreciate how massive it is because, it sort of focuses you into what you are interested in. So I forget what the number is, but the number of hours of content that's uploaded every day, I mean, it's millions upon millions of hours. So when you think of it that way, it's kind of overwhelming to think how anyone could ever find, your little piece, your little island there. So when I started out, honestly, I don't even remember exactly what I kind of thought would happen. I just started putting out some of these videos, and I mean, it was slow going, to start it. I mean, it was. one view a day, maybe that kind of thing. And you're just like, you look at it and you're like, well, is it even worth doing? I mean, you get five people who maybe watch a video in a week, and you're just thinking, I put a bunch of hours into this and no one really seems to care. So, I kind of went through that. This was before COVID, and just realized that, gee, it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. I mean, you look at some of those big YouTube channels, the Rick Shields or the Mr. Short Game, or some of the different teaching ones, and they've got, hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and I'm sitting there with, you know, 30 subscribers. And so it's a little disheartening when you start out. I think a lot of people probably quit and give up pretty early on. But yeah, once COVID happened and I said, you know what, I've got extra time, I'm going to start trying to be more regimented and trying to increase the amount of content, and the quality of it, trying to be better with better camera, better audio, things like that. And that's kind of when it started to slowly pick up. And then it really helps, I think, if you have one video that people kind of latch onto. That was what I noticed. I had one video where I talked about how adjustable hosel golf clubs work, the specifically drivers, but for any of them. But I realized that there was really nothing on YouTube that was really covering this, what I thought was the right way, and very, very few people understood just the basic mechanics of what was going on, how it works, why it works. And so I did that video, and that was the first one that actually sort of, you know, picked up enough momentum and started pulling in more subscribers. And so that's kind of where things started moving in a more positive direction, where I said, well, yeah, maybe this, maybe I stick with this for a while and see what comes of it.
You kind of mentioned this earlier, but what are some of the most common mistakes that you see made in club building specifically?
There are two different, I feel like there's two different extremes. So you've got, on one side, you've got people who are just very sort of haphazard in what they're doing and aren't measuring properly, the old adage of you should measure twice and cut once, that kind of thing. And or don't care about, waiting, or all these different things. So you've got that side, but then I think just as problematic are people on the other extreme who are so laser focused in on trying to hit just, tiny little precise specifications that you kind of lose. You're never going to be perfect. And in the game of golf, obviously, this is a very imperfect game. So, they spend all this time trying to make sure that the swing weights or the lengths or the frequency of the shafts or all these different things are so precise, and they sort of lose the bigger picture of, what's really important, what's not going to be as important.
Yeah, well, those things that really, at the end of the day, the whole point of the club is to drive performance. And so, if the club might feel some way, it might look some way, etc. But if it's not improving your performance, then there's no point. Then you really haven't done anything. You just spent a lot of time doing nothing. Uh, that
Exactly.
makes sense. As far as like some of those early videos um, that you put up, what I'm interested in mainly here is like, what did you find that people were interested in that they didn't know already? Like, I've seen some of your videos about, hey, here's how to regrip a club without using any sort of or with but by using compressed air, which is something that prior to seeing that video, I had no clue was a possibility. The industry norm, as I had understood it, was, you know, you cut the old one off, remove the tape, rewrap some tape, put on some solution, shake it up, force it on there as best you can, and then uh, don't move it for uh, an hour or two or something like that. What have you found, and like specifically some of those like smaller things that you found are interesting? Like what have you found that's useful to people?
Yeah. So, my audience, obviously, and that was part of, I think, the issue starting out was if you have a general equipment, let's say golf YouTube channel, yes, you have more competition, but you also have a lot more potential viewers. What I was doing was obviously niche. It was, specific to people who are interested in wanting to do this. But anyway, so I realized that, I've sort of got a couple different audiences on my channel. I've got people who are specifically there for the very technical club building stuff. And then I've got people who are, in some cases, may be interested in sort of dipping their toe in, or in some cases, they're less interested in that and more interested on the fitting side, because I did some of those videos too. So some of the early videos I did had to do with things like figuring out your lie angle on your own, figuring out the right club length. Those were the videos I found that did well to start with, because the actual club building videos were always slower. Um, Now I have some that have quite a few views on them now, where I go sort of step by step through the process of building a club or reshafting or something like that. But those videos are always sort of a very smooth, gradual uh, slope on them. The ones where I do more stuff with, fitting related things that you can do yourself at home versus having to have a professional help you with it. Again, be it lie angle, be it figuring out length or different things like that. Those videos I feel like definitely seem to uh, move a little bit faster, have a few more views right off the bat. And so that was one thing I noticed. And then, like you said, the videos where you do something that basically, if you find something that people are interested in and present it in a new way, like that compressed air. And there were other people doing compressed air videos. Compressed air I knew about for a long time, and my problem was always that, you know, I thought, well, you're going to need a big compressor. It's big, it's heavy, it's super loud, it's obnoxious to deal with, and so that's where I had the idea of using that tire inflator, which is very small, compact, and inexpensive. And so that was one of those videos that definitely, it hit that right sweet spot basically, and it's gotten a lot of views. And if I knew how to pick every video that well, then I'd be doing a lot better. It's just sort of, sometimes I'll do a video and I'll think, oh yeah, this thing is going to take off like a rocket, and it just sits there and it doesn't really do anything. So I am clearly not a YouTube expert as far as predicting uh, what's going to work and what's not. It's just sort of, I just try and produce videos that I think my audience will get something out of, and hopefully they do.
That's perfect. And the reason I'd ask that question about what people were interested in, because it kind of dives into the next one I had, which is the practicalities of it. You said, okay, like people are interested in how to measure their own lie angle, how to measure their own loft, etc. One, if you're a golfer, why is that something that's important to you? How does that impact as far as like your setup, like your whole club setup? How does it affect that? And then also, I don't know if you can do that, if you can tell us without like having it in front of you. But can you describe to us like a way that someone might, check their lie, check their loft? Because I know for me, I had a set of clubs back when I was back right before college. I got injured and with a stress fracture. And long story short, it had nothing to do with the clubs, but just like how my hand had was broken because I had played so much golf and not rested. Similarly, the shafts of my clubs had bent by about 4 degrees. So my 7 iron was down 4 degrees. Like the shaft was, I didn't even notice because I wasn't good at looking at things. But you look down the shaft and it was curved. So tell us a little bit more about why people care, how it affects things, and then also how they might check something like that themselves.
Okay, yeah. I'll tell you, it's surprising, just as a quick side note, how many people have steel shafts that have some sort of pronounced bend in them. And in some cases it just happens if they are old shafts. It eventually just sort of works their way and they start to get bent down stronger. In some cases, certain kinds of golfers, obviously stronger golfers, are more likely to have that happen, or hitting off a lot of mats versus grass. In some cases, certain shafts, honestly, the quality control has not been very good. And so there are certain shafts out there on the market that are notorious for this sort of thing. But to get back to your original question, as far as how you would do it or why it's important, we'll just do loft and lie. Loft is obviously loft is very important when it comes to, you know, distance, when it comes to trajectory. It's the most important thing. And so, I did a video on the Elite Fit Golf channel, or a couple videos so far, where I look at what happens if I start bending the loft stronger on my irons. And I've done it with a 6-iron, I've done it with a 9-iron, and sort of bending them down in 2-degree increments and trying to figure out, where's the sweet spot of, I can bend them to a certain point and get a benefit, as far as a benefit being more distance. But then at what point do they become less functional, less hittable? And so if we're talking about lofts, I think the easiest way for a golfer to figure it out is really just to sort of, either go through a gapping session, if you have the ability, or just, on the course, pay attention to, if I'm hitting my 8-iron, say 150 yards, and I'm hitting my 7-iron 165, but then I'm hitting my 6-iron 165 also, or 168. Obviously, there can be different reasons for that, but a big possibility is that, well, possibly that 6-iron loft is no longer in the right spot, or maybe the 7-iron loft is not in the right spot. So just sort of going through your bag and figuring out, it doesn't necessarily matter what the actual numbers are in the club. That really doesn't make any difference. It's when you get out on the golf course and you start hitting those clubs, are you hitting the right yardages, and are you filling in all those gaps that you need to? So that would be my best advice as far as loft goes. And if you feel like there is a problem, then you go and you find a good club builder, who can actually measure those, who can look at them and figure out, yes, it's the club needs to be adjusted, or maybe the club, in theory, the numbers are all matching up, but you just aren't hitting them that way. And so, we bend them to fit the golfer. We're not building clubs in a vacuum. You have to make them work for the golfer. So even if that means your 6-iron and your 7-iron have 1 degree of loft difference, but you hit them where you want to hit them, well, that's what's important. When we talk about lie angle is one of those things that's very easy to figure out on your own. And a lot of people, everyone sort of has, I think, if you've played golf long enough, everyone knows what a lie board is, which, you used to go to a fit-in, or you'd go to try out clubs, and it's this hard piece of plastic, and you would hit golf balls off it. And then they would look at the sole of the club and sort of figure out, oh, is it coming in with the toe down, or is it coming in with the toe up? And you would bend the club accordingly off of that. And in some cases that worked, in some cases it really didn't. It could give you some faulty information depending on your swing path and things like that. So the easiest way to do it is and I've done videos on this as well, but it's just known as a line test, or a Sharpie test, or which is basically you draw a vertical line on a golf ball with a Sharpie or with a dry erase marker, and then you set up the ball with the line perpendicular to the ground, pointing in the opposite direction of your target. So the line is facing your club head at address, and you just hit the ball. And what you're looking for is, if the club has the correct lie angle, you should see that line be straight up and down, right? But if the lie angle is incorrect, well, then that line is either going to be pointing off one direction or the other, because as the club comes in, if the club is coming in toe down and you hit the ball, the line is going to show up, pointing up sort of towards you. And if it's the other way, then it's going to be pointing the other way. And you can basically take that based on how much that angle is, and you can figure out how much you need to bend the golf club. But that's a very simple, straightforward, and very precise way to do it. You don't need to get on TrackMan, or you don't need me to get out my GC quad and measure that using cameras, it's completely accurate. And as long as you have, as long as you get that line straight up and down, and you're on a flat surface to start with, it's extremely accurate.
That is cool. As far as when we're talking about lie angle, let's say I came to you and my lie angle was uh, at impact was 4 degrees upright, not as far as the measurement of the club, but as far as how I was coming into and hitting the ball. What kind of variances would you expect to see from someone? Everybody I know has different adaptations, and how the club interacts with the ground can be different. But what sort of variances would you expect if for someone who had that sort of setup? And then beyond that, as far as you're talking, also something interesting about lofts, like, if there's a difference between your 7 iron and 6 iron, it's 1 degree. That's okay as long as it does what you want. Is that how I know? Like, you take someone like Bryson has like what people might call loft jacked his clubs, and like there's a debate, I imagine, kind of on it, whether warranted or not, about what's going on. And so, and his response would be, well, ignoring the naming of the club, like he'd say, "Oh, my 7 iron, it comes in like a 7 iron. So, yeah, it's lofted like a 5 iron, but it lands like a 7 iron." And for most people, that that isn't something that matters. So we don't need to worry about like, oh, whether it actually should be called a 7 or not iron or not. What I'm more interested in is, do you see that in a lot of sets that you're dealing with a lot of players? Like, I really need to change off these stock lofts and maybe get a club to fly a little differently, or like a little lower, this sort of loft jacking.
Okay, yeah. So, first question, talking about lie angles, and I think those lie boards that I referenced in the beginning put in people's mind, or maybe just a lot of the old fitting people back when they were doing a lot of that, gave this sort of misconception about what's really important here when we're talking about lie angle. The important thing about lie angle is really less to do with how the ball comes into how the club comes into the turf, right? I think people think about it like, oh, if it's too flat, then the toe comes into the ground and drags and it makes you, hang it open or something like that. And it's really not, that's really not how it works in most cases, unless you get down into your wedges, because all the other clubs in your bag, you're hitting ball and then ground. The only time where the golf club actually is making contact with the ground before it makes contact with the ball is when you get into the higher lofted wedges, because they have to sort of get underneath the ball to get to that right point on the face. But the really important thing when we're talking about lie angle, what it does is anytime you have a club, an iron, a wood, anything, a putter, as you move that lie angle, as that face changes in the lie, there is a directional change that corresponds to that. So what ends up happening is if your lie angle is too flat and the toe is what we would call too far down, it opens the club face up, everything else being equal. This assumes, assuming we're in a vacuum, we're not modifying or adjusting anything during our swing to compensate. But if you just start with that and the club is too far flat, it's going to leave the club face open. And likewise, if it's too upright, it's going to leave it closed. So what ends up happening is if your lie angle is not right, your start lines are going to be left and right, or right of where you think they should be, even though you may be perfectly lined up, perfectly square. The club face may be perfectly square to your target, but because that angle of your lie is off, it changes the angle, it changes the direction of the face. And the other part of this that people don't always realize is as the club face gets flatter and flatter, meaning as we go from short irons to long irons to your woods, that influence becomes less and less. So the lie angle on a driver is far less impactful as far as your start line goes versus it is on your wedges or your short irons, because when you have more loft, any sort of change in the lie is much more dramatic as far as your initial start line. Now, you do also, not to get too technical, but you also bring spin into the equation, obviously. And the longer you hit the ball, the longer the ball's in the air, the more spin, you can get more dispersion that way as well. But in general, I think a lot of people worry about the lie angle on their drivers, and the change that, like you said 4 degrees. The change that you end up seeing if you have a driver that's 4 degrees off on lie angle, when we're talking about the actual uh, face direction, is, I'm trying to remember the exact number. I've done all the math. I've done this in a video, but it's less than a quarter of a degree off for 4 degrees of a lie angle change. So and if you span that out to say 300 yards, it basically means, 5 to 10 yards offline, depending on the spin, things like that. So it's a very small amount. Now, when you get into the wedges, obviously, then it's a much more exaggerated amount, because that initial angle is going to be, the initial direction is going to be greater. So that's why I think it's especially important to make sure your irons, your wedges are dialed in for that.
Perfect. And then, sorry, as far as the loft jacking, et cetera. Sorry that
Oh,
I asked such a long question there. As far as the loft jacking, et cetera, what do you see on that front? As far as like when you're fitting people, are you oftentimes messing around with those lofts more to create good gapping when you're doing your gapping sessions?
yeah, I would say the lofts are, if you were talking about trying to change ball flight in any fitting application, loft is always going to be the biggest impact. People will try and say that, oh, we put you in a different shaft, and using the different shaft characteristics, that's going to change things. The difference that makes is very small in general, and it's very inconsistent both from player to player and short term to long term. When you talk about lofts, it's always impactful. It always changes regardless of the golfer, and it's not something that is a short term, long term issue. So, I get people all the time who are wanting to sort of change the lofts, and it's not necessarily loft jacking that I see across an entire set. It's more trying to figure out, again, trying to figure out the gapping, and figure out, especially when you get into the longer clubs and you maybe have a utility iron or some sort of hybrid or something. It's trying to figure out what is the right club, uh, to hit that number that's in between your your last longest standard iron versus a utility club, a hybrid, something like that. So that's where I see it more, and I deal more with better golfers in general, more amateur, starting golfers. Again, loft jacking, it's just one of those things where, you know, doesn't matter what club you say you're hitting when you hit it. It's whatever gets the right result and gets the right distance and hopefully gets it on the green. So, if it's a pitching wedge, it's a pitching wedge. If it's an 8 iron, it's an 8 iron. And hopefully, I'm sure some people are going to be too vain to want to admit to having to hit an 8 iron, say if their golf buddies are hitting a nine or a wedge, and so they might seek out more distance that way. But again, at the end of the day, I can remember plenty of golfers who were 100 times better than me, who basically hit it 200 yards off the tee, 200, 200, 200, sink the putt, and end up shooting even par rounds every time. So
So I had an experience recently where there was an older man who's just now getting into golf, and he lives on a golf course, and so he's walking around, he's picking up all these balls in his free time, and he was like, Cooper, like, I know you play golf, I have all these balls, and they're all Pro V1s, and he's like, should I play Pro V1s because my swing speed is only like 100 miles an hour with a driver, and I assume he's watched Golf Channel or read Golf Digest or something and read one of these articles by a ball company that says you should buy this lower compression ball for lower swing speeds. I went ahead and told him, no, like, just use the Pro V1. It's mostly, in my opinion, a marketing gimmick that you should buy a lower compression ball for a lower swing speed. Um, but what is your thoughts on using lower compression balls if you have lower swing speed?
Um, yeah. So, well, first off, I would tell him if he's got all these free balls, I would use the free balls before
Yeah.
I would spend money on the Pro V1s. I think a lot of it is, the difference that you're going to see as a high handicapper with any ball is obviously going to be less of an issue. So, spending top dollar on a tour quality ball, if you are only hitting it, 180 yards and you're not really generating enough spin for it to really matter, it probably doesn't make much difference. So I would say, if he's got the Pro V1s and he's been finding them, then go ahead and use them. But I don't know that I would tell him to go out and spend money on Pro V1s as a beginner golfer. All the golf balls now, I feel like they're pretty. I mean, they're all excellent, right? And the best balls have that perfect combination that you can hit it long and you can still spin it as much as you want to. But it's just a matter of finding a ball that works for you, that you don't mind, that you're not kicking yourself too hard if it goes into the woods and you lose it. As far as lower compression goes, I always think lower compression is always a better idea as the weather gets colder. And I don't know if that is, I haven't really tested it. It just seems like that always makes sense to me that if the weather is nasty, I think a lower compression ball can be helpful just to sort of get a little more out of it and just have a little softer feel. But again, that's sort of more of a personal thing. I have a video planned on the channel that actually uh, I think Keenan's going to help me out with. I don't even know if I've mentioned it to him yet, this one, but looking at golf balls and temperature. So I can get back to you on that.
Perfect. As far as golf balls go, obviously compression changes things a lot, and someone or doesn't necessarily change things a lot, but like spin, those types of factors will change how a ball flies, etc. And so sometimes I know like people find waterlogged balls and they don't know it's waterlogged and the ball flies funny. And most amateurs who aren't that elite, uh, they won't notice it, but the higher level you get, the more people notice things. As far besides golf balls, when it comes to golf clubs, how can a lot of times, amateurs get fit into a set and they don't realize, something's A, wrong with them at the outset, or B, something's wrong with them later. I've had driver head, Cooper and I both have had driver heads that have gone dead, 3-wood heads that have gone dead. And if I wasn't friends with people that had that experience, I would think, oh, my swing's the problem. Like, one, what sort of issues do you oftentimes see where something was A, fit wrong, or B, just goes wrong over time? And second, as far as like diagnosing them, what sorts of issues should someone be looking at in their set and say, this one might not be on me, this one might be on the equipment.
Okay, so here, I'm going to answer the second question first, and then hopefully I'll remember the first one, or you can guide me back to it. But as far as figuring out if something is wrong, so one thing I always recommend is that, anytime you go and play golf, just like if you were a pilot, you go and you walk around the plane and you inspect everything and you make sure everything is where it's supposed to be. I think it's always a good idea to, look through your clubs and just make sure that everything seems to be right. Simple things like, is there a gap between the ferrule and the hosel? Or like we talked about before, holding the club, looking at it going down the line, down the shaft from the grip to the head, and looking, rotating it, and seeing, is the shaft bent? Things like that that you don't necessarily notice when you just pull it out and set it on the ground and hit it. But if you sort of have it in your mind to be looking for these sorts of things, then it's going to be easier to spot them. So I would definitely say that. Obviously, the way that golf clubs are made now, because they are so thin with the faces, specifically with drivers and fairway woods, but also with irons now, because I see a fair number. I mean, not a lot, but I've seen a surprising number, I would say, for me at least, is that you end up getting faces that crack somewhere. And that's, I mean, that's when we're talking about a dead head, that is pretty much usually what the culprit is there's some sort of bond failure, either, it's usually in those seam areas between, I think, the different parts of the driver head, because they're all made up of, 4 or 5 different pieces. But that is usually where something goes wrong, and oftentimes that's going to correspond to a change in the sound of it. I would say that's a pretty easy way to tell. But again, just sort of examining it, looking at the driver face. I've had irons brought to me where down by the bottom groove, you can see that the head completely, the face completely sort of caves in. And again, if you just set it down behind the ball and you aren't really looking at it, you may not notice it. But if you hold it up to your face, like a foot away, then it becomes more apparent. So those would be the kind of things, as far as if there's an actual issue, structural, mechanical, we'll say, issue with your clubs. As far as things that for fittings go, then we start to get into a whole different can of worms, because it's, you know, the problem with fitting, and I say this as someone who fits people, but your fitting is basically you trying to put somebody into a makeup of golf club at a precise moment in time, in a precise set of, in a certain set of variables. So they are usually, they're oftentimes hitting into a screen inside. So the lighting may be different, depending how they're swinging that day. You know, things can change, and not even just how they're swinging that day, but how they are swinging, when they hit their first 15 balls of the day of the fitting to when they hit their 115th ball of the day. Things change, your body changes. We are not robots. And so, I think everyone has to sort of keep that in mind. That's always been one of my big things about fitting, is these ideas, and I see this more often than I like to see, but there are certain fitters out there who fit people into very specific setups and sort of try and claim that, this is the perfect quote unquote setup for you. This is the perfect head, the perfect shaft. This is exactly, this is that there's only one key to unlock your golf game, and this is that key. And it's just not how golf works. It's just not accurate. So I think the important thing with any fitting really is to understand and be aware of, when you go to a fitting, just paying attention to what types of things influence you more and make more of an impact on your game. So it's not just, oh, the fitter says X head and Y shaft. I don't know why. I don't know, but the numbers were good. What was the weight of that shaft? What are the specs of that shaft that are important? What was the loft of the head? Those sorts of things matter, because you can take that information and you can translate that both to, whether it's you're making that purchase decision that day or down the road, or, you get the driver and you're thinking about fairway woods, or, because ideally your entire set should sort of be, there should be a flow there, right? From your shortest club to your longest club. That's always one of my big things, is you want everything to sort of flow, be it in the length, be it in their static weights, be it in the swing weight sort of feel to them. You want everything to sort of have a nice smooth progression, so there's not any random club there where you pick it up and all of a sudden it feels like, well, this feels way different. And I think that's one of the most important things, that, at least in my opinion, is to make sure that all your clubs have they play as a team. They complement each other.
So that's kind of a good lead into my next question, which is, I have a prediction that over the next 3 to 5 years on tour, you will see less and less 3 woods being in play. And the reason for that being is that a 3 wood for most tour players would go around 280 when they would carry their driver 300, and their dispersion left to right on the driver maybe 65 yards. their dispersion left to right on the 3-wood, maybe around that number, maybe a little bit less. And so if you're going to be hitting a club shorter, but the same amount offline, it's kind of an obsolete golf club.
Right.
And I've experienced this in my own game. I'm curious to see if you have seen people take out their 3-wood for that reason, and what solutions have they found if they have done that.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of those things that's sort of a case by case basis, but you always hear them say, specifically on tour, that the 3-wood is debatably the hardest club to find one that works for you, because they're trying to find, they want something that they can hit off the tee to a certain distance and they can get good, penetrating ball flight, but then they also want to have it that they can, hit it off the deck and carry it and land it soft. And so it's a tricky combination. It's asking a lot from a single golf club, but I do think, yeah, in a lot of cases, people are finding different options, whether it's, a higher lofted, more like a 4-wood type of club that makes a little more sense. But I don't know. It's like you said, if your dispersion is equal, whether you're hitting a driver or a fairway wood, then where's the real benefit of having that fairway wood? At least if you plan on using it off the tee. Um,
There's just not very many holes in the world where you are forced to hit it exactly 280 yards. It's usually the only reason people try to hit the fairway wood is to hit the fairway. But that doesn't really seem to be the case when you look at statistics.
right. No, definitely agree. Yeah, it seems like the drivers are so dialed in general, and they're, for most people, so they're easier to hit at this point than a fairway would. And so, most people are just going to automatically, unless there is a hazard or something that physically, stops you and you have to throttle back, then it seems like it's driver all day long.
That concept that you mentioned of, you know, a marriage of or trying to do too much in just one club is something that one of our former guests, Will Canal, tweeted out on Twitter the other day. He said that he was going to go, like, his life's work essentially is to get rid of the 3-wood because it serves essentially no purpose. And I know he himself would say, like, that's not exactly true, but essentially, like, it's very limited use cases where I end up using a 3-wood. Most of the time, it's either driver or it's a hybrid or it's an iron. And part of the problem is that, trying to put too much functionality into one club. If you're trying to replace a 3-wood without actually using a 3-wood exactly, like Cooper has found that he has like a 16-degree hybrid in his bag, and he gets like pretty close to what a 3-wood would get to, but it's easier to hit off the ground. It flies pretty close to the same. And all in all, like, if he's blocked off the tee at 280, it's good. And most of the time, like, you're not going for too many greens where you're having to hit 3-wood, especially when you think about like how the ball has to land to going into the green. Most of the times, it doesn't make too much sense. What sort of options, if someone came to you and said, "Look, like, I haven't hit my 3-wood in 4 months. I don't hate it, but it really serves no purpose in my game." What would you add to that upper level of the bag that might give them something that they could use in their game more rather than just have a club sitting there taking up space?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, the two options are going to be either you go with some sort of hybrid, low lofted, you know, 16, 15-degree hybrid, um, which I would definitely say is going to be an option for some people, but once a hybrid gets down below 17 degrees, there's going to be a definite population that aren't really probably going to see much of a benefit out of that. It just starts to get low. Now, if you're strong enough and you've got the speed for it, then it can be a good option, like it sounds like it is. But again, I wouldn't necessarily rush everybody into that option, because it is, once you start to get those extremely low lofted clubs, it does require some more speed. So then the other option would be, well, if a 3-wood isn't work, then maybe you move into again, something, a 4 wood or even a 5 wood, and just go, as a driver 5 wood, because, I think 5 woods in general, you see them popping up, you see them pop up on tour, depending on the week and depending on the setup, a fair amount. And so, again, it's a little bit shorter. So it's a little, I don't know. I haven't looked at the exact numbers as far as dispersion goes with 5 woods, but I feel like it's a lot tighter when it comes to 5 woods than 3 woods. Uh, but again, if you have a 5 wood, or maybe you have a 5 wood that's adjustable and you crank it down to 17 or 16 and a half, something like that, and play with an option like that. And of course, the other option would be to just go more of the straight utility club, and go, again, extremely low lofted, sort of more of the 1 iron idea. But again, that's going to depend on the golfer, and that's clearly in most cases going to be more of a tee only option. You're not really probably going to be wanting to hit a 14 degree or something, utility iron out of the fairway, unless you're playing in Scotland. So
Yeah, I've really enjoyed having that super low lofted hybrid, and under the right conditions, I can still hit it out of the rough, which I, as you mentioned, couldn't do with the 1 iron or probably the 3 wood. But I had another, I've been thinking another thing about my club setup, and it's started about a couple months ago. I went to the course, um, playing like normal, and then I discovered I didn't have my 60 degree in the bag, and so I come across, I miss a couple greens. I have to hit like a flop shot, and I just pull my 56 degree out, and I'm like, I'm able to hit every single shot that I hit with my 60 with my 56 degree, and it made me think of a few years back, in the U.S. Amateur Final Four. Cohen Trolio, he made it all the way to the Final Four at Pinehurst without a 60 degree, and that place is nearly impossible around the greens. So I am honestly really considering taking out my 60 degree, just because I feel like I lean on it too much. And if you know what your limitations are, you really don't need a 60 degree. So what are your thoughts on that?
so yeah, I think way too many people have those high lofted wedges in their bag and don't need them. Like you said, I mean, if we're talking about amateur golfers, weekend golfers, most golf courses aren't really going to require you to hit those kinds of shots. You don't have those sorts of setups. Nobody's tucking pins, 3 paces off of a bunker because you're trying to not have 6 hour rounds at your public golf course. Um, but even as a better player, the more loft you put on a wedge, the more difficult it becomes to hit. Just the simple fact is, the more loft it has, the harder you have to swing it, the longer you have to make your swing in order to hit the ball whatever distance. And so the longer your swing gets, the more that opens the door for different issues to come in. Um, and I think this also, I did a couple. I will call it a series of videos, basically, where I look at this idea of changing the shafts out in your wedges in order to drop the ball flight down a little and increase the backspin. And this has been done for a while. This was explained to me by a guy by the name of Howard Jones. But the basic concept is that when you swing a wedge, or you swing any golf club, at impact, in theory, you have forward deflection where the club shaft has bent forward a little bit. It increases the loft a little bit. And so you get this forward deflection, you get more loft on the iron or the wedge. And what you find is, the higher the wedge loft gets, the more the ball flight, the more the trajectory goes up, but the spin actually goes down, because what ends up happening is the ball just sort of bounces off the face. These modern golf balls, they don't compress as much. They don't sort of stick onto the face and get that rotation. And the higher the loft gets on the club, the less ability you have to actually compress the ball and get that spin. So, in your shorter clubs, your 8, your 9, your pitching wedge, you have a certain amount of spin that you would expect from them. But when you start to get into those 56, 60-degree wedges, all of a sudden the spin numbers don't correspond anymore because the ball is just sort of glancing against the face and then popping up in the air, but with very little spin. And anytime you get that situation where you've got, the ball sort of floating around in the air, it's going to be less exact. You're not going to have, that's where you get the case where you start to see things like flyers and things when in one case you may catch one with a lot more spin and then another one, it sort of flutters out there and all of a sudden you've flown the green by, you know, 15 yards. So I think again with the higher lofted wedges, that becomes more of an issue. And again, it depends where you're playing, but unless you find that you need that extra loft, which again you can take a 56 or something close to it, open it up, and assuming you don't have too much bounce on that wedge, and you have to open it up on some sort of hard pan lie where that the design of that wedge might hinder that, and there you would maybe want to see a 60. But in many cases, especially if you're hitting out of thicker rough, things like that, then a 60, there's not really a benefit. If it's thick rough, you can hit a 56 just as easily.
That makes sense. I think that Andrew Rice actually did a study on that, and I forget whether it was launch angle or dynamic loft, but essentially the optimal amount was about 45 degrees, which isn't that surprising when you think about it, as far as getting the most spin goes, because it's kind of like shooting a catapult. And for the most part, like if you get it right in that, if it's too straight, then it's going to go straight up and down. If it's too flat, you're shooting something that's going to go essentially directly into the ground. And similarly, when it comes to spin, if you have too much loft there, there's not going to be there's going to be too much deflection, and too much of that force is going to be lost. And that's essentially what hitting a golf ball is, and the changing of lofts is the change in the amount that the ball is deflected, which is a weird way to look at it. But there's an optimal amount of deflection for spin, it sounds like. And when you're in that 60 degree to higher range, it's not necessarily what you need. So that's cool to know. And we only have two more questions left for you. So I'll lay them on you one at a time as opposed to two at a time and make them really long. Um, you talked about a lot of what we talked about today has been about gapping. Like, all right, I'm going to get fitted. Like, I want to make sure I'm getting my gapping right. I want to make sure this. I want to make sure that. A lot of people haven't been fitted for golf clubs. Will Knaut, who I mentioned earlier, he won the Byron Nelson Award this last year. Was the number one ranked D3 golfer. Was is going to play in the Byron Nelson next year, and we asked him like, "What do you do club wise?" And mind you, like he's getting his PhD in statistics from Columbia, Carnegie Mellon kid, like smart kid. He's like, "Yeah, I've never been fitted before. I just kind of worked it out." And so if he hasn't been fitted for, there's plenty of other people who haven't been fitted before. And I think it's super easy to say, "Hey, like I'm gonna go to Golfsmith back when it was around. Hey, I'm gonna go to uh, Club Champion. I'm going to go to Golf Tech." I'm not saying those places don't do a great job, and there might be people there that do well. When it comes to a fitting, what should people be looking for as far as a fitter goes? Like, what should they expect a fitter to talk about? What should they expect to like? How will they know they're being like? What are some like general rules of thumb to make sure? Hey, like I'm kind of getting fit in the right direction, and not just one getting like put into stuff that's going to make them more money and not make me better.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's two metrics when it comes to fitters that I sort of look at, and one is the knowledge level, going from someone who's been doing this a long time and knows what they're doing to someone who just sort of calls themselves a fitter and may or may not just sort of look up at the screen and have a sheet of paper that basically has a list of if swing speed is X, then launch angle should be Y, and just sort of paint by numbers, let's call it. The other element is is honesty, quite frankly. And there are, I think, plenty of examples out there, and I've had plenty of people tell me all kinds of stories about fittings that were not necessarily, uh, you know, did not necessarily have the golfer's best interest at heart, like you said. And so those are the two different, those are the two things that I would look at for any fitter. And as far as figuring out what kind you have, I mean, what I have always told people on my channel is I think in order to get the most out of any fitting, regardless of your level, whether you are base amateur or elite, high class, world class player, you need to come in and have done some homework beforehand. You know, have some basic understanding of not just things you want to look at, but some basic understanding of, what exactly is in your bag right now. What are the lofts in your irons right now? What are the shaft weights that you've got right now? Things like that. Because if you don't know that and you just get up and you start hitting a set of irons and then somebody gives you something different, maybe you see 15 yards more carry, or and whatever it is, whatever parameters you're looking for in order to make a decision. But if you don't understand why that's happening, where that's coming from, it's very easy to just sort of be led into whatever the fitter maybe in some cases wants to put you in, as opposed to, oh, if this is why that's happening, well, we can also look at this club or this club or this shaft or this shaft. So that's one of my biggest things is if you're going to go to a fitting, if you're going to spend the money on the fitting, I think it just makes sense that people do just do their homework, just sort of have at least a basic understanding of what you're coming in with. And maybe, you don't need to know exactly, what club you were wanting to hit, or, you may or may not have a list of shafts or heads or whatever that you're wanting to try out, but at least try and have an idea of what kinds of things you're wanting to experiment with, whether it's going from 130-gram iron shafts and trying 105-gram shafts, or trying something where the long irons have more aggressive lofts, any of those types of things. Just sort of have a game plan and have some information under your belt before you go in, because if you just go in, starry-eyed and just saying, I don't care what it costs, I just want the best quote unquote thing, then don't be surprised if you in some cases get fit into a combination that is somewhat obscure and probably extremely expensive. And so that would be those would be my best recommendations before you go to a fitting. Again, if you've got personal references, obviously from people who have been to a certain fitter and they can actually say that this fitter was great or this fitter was not great. Um, it gets a little tricky, and until you're really in the fitting, you won't necessarily know, and a lot of golfers won't know even after the fitting necessarily if they haven't done some homework first. Um, but that would be my best tip, is to do some homework, make sure you have an understanding of where you're at right now, and have a game plan at least, so you can kind of. I think it's always better for the player to sort of lead or steer the fitting versus the fitter steering it.
That's good. I I appreciate it. So, Adam, the last question we ask every guest is: if you go back to yourself as a junior golfer and tell yourself one thing, what would it be? And in your case, you're a fitter here. So, one, we ask you that question, but two, we also would ask if you could tell a junior golfer one thing about fitting, what would it be?
Okay. As far as going back and myself, yeah, I don't know. That's a tough question. I think some golfers honestly benefit from having tons of information. And then some golfers, like you said, see ball, hit ball. they don't know what their set makeup is really. They don't, they just sort of, they've used the clubs long enough and they've figured out how to make them work. And that's the thing about really good golfers, elite golfers, is honestly, you can take a golf club and hand it to an elite golfer, and it could be completely wrong. It could be wrong on every spec in the book. But a really good golfer is going to be able to figure out how to make that club work. Now, ideally, that's not what you want to have happen, but it's true that better golfers are going to be more adaptable to equipment, and so it's just going to be, there's a balance between having enough information and understanding what is important, and then maybe having too much information. As far as junior golfers and looking at junior golfers at an elite level, things that I would say I would want to keep in the back of my mind. I would say first off, obviously this goes for any golfer, but don't necessarily just look at what tour pros are doing when you're trying to figure out your set makeup, right? You don't necessarily need to have extra stiff 75-gram driver shaft tipped an inch and a half because whoever on tour is using it. That's make sure your club setup, make sure your equipment is right based on both your game, and where you play it. Like we talked about the 60-degree wedges. If you're playing golf and you never are in those sorts of places where you need those clubs, then then it doesn't make sense to have it in your bag at that moment in time. I would say that's so that's something. And then I would also say, again, looking at what tour players do, it's not always a fixed set of 14 clubs that they bring to an event, right? Depending on the course, depending on the conditions, they're going to be switching things out. Maybe they have a 3-wood one week, maybe they have a utility a different week, 5-wood, maybe they have an extra wedge, maybe they play around with, maybe they have different bounces, things like that. But again, just sort of understanding that really kind of where you're playing, what kind of golf you're playing, let that in part dictate what your equipment looks like, what your set makeup looks like.
Perfect. We appreciate you taking the time to join us. Where can people learn more about you, find you on social media, all that stuff?
Yeah, so I've got 2 YouTube channels. The first one is Mobile Club Maker Golf, and that is my channel basically at this point where I focus on club building and club repair type of content. And then I now also have Elite Fit Golf, which corresponds to the name of the new business where I have the fitting studio and I have all my repair shop and custom build shop, all that stuff. But I also have Elite Fit Golf, which is my other YouTube channel where that is going to be focusing more on, again, fitting equipment specific, different kinds of clubs, different styles of head, shafts, things like that. And you can also find me on Instagram at Mobile Club Maker. So people, if they have questions or things like that, that seems to be a pretty good way to usually get in touch with me is through that Instagram.
Thanks for joining us today. Please do us a big favor and like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts so we can help others learn how to play better tournament golf. You can find us online at thetournamentcode.com, on Instagram at thetournamentcode, and on Twitter at tournamentcode. As always, feel free to reach out to us at those places or email us at daniel@thetournamentcode.com and cooper@thetournamentcode.com. We hope you join us as we continue to dive deeper into what it takes to play elite tournament golf.